yeah, we're going to talk about the role of technology, threat or catalyst to human prosperity. And what's really great is the panel we've been able to pull together to have this discussion. We are going to talk about how human behavior, cultural values, social contracts, how they adapt and respond to the advancement of technology. Certainly the topic of prosperity and the continued automation of our work, which is kind of a more practical view of pulling this together. So let me introduce our panel to you. To my left is Erica Dhawan. She's the CEO of Cotential. Thank you for being here, Erica. To Erica's left, we have Julia Kirby, who is an author. Many of you will know of the book that she's published in the last year with Tom Davenport, Only Humans Need Apply. Thank you again, Julia, for being with us. To her left is Rahaf Harfoush. She's the digital anthropologist. Very, very excited to have you here as well. And to her left, we have Tapscott. Dhawan is the CEO of the Tapscott Group. Many of you know Dhawan. He's also an adjunct professor for the Rotman School of Management. So what we're going to do is have each of our panelists share with you their perspective and their view, and then we're going to get into some questions and talk about some of these topics. So if I could please ask Erica if you can kick it off for us. Thank you.
Thank you. In December 2014, Sydney, Australia faced a major crisis. 17 people were held hostage by a terrorist in a cafe in the central business district. While most people across Sydney fled to their homes on taxis and subways, something else was going on. Uber, which is the car-sharing service in Sydney, was charging users up to 10 times the normal rate because they had a simple algorithm. When there was high demand and low supply, they would charge more to their customers. People on Twitter began to condemn the company for charging astronomical rates during a terrorist attack. And Uber very quickly responded to this PR scandal. They apologized, they offered free rides for anyone in Sydney that day. But there is a much bigger conversation I want to have about that story. The conversation is about how do we ensure we trust more than algorithms and data when we still need human insight and human experience. Uber has a simple algorithm. A rise in demand leads to a rise in surge pricing. But how do we ensure that we design ways to understand the reasons behind the surge and embed those in how we make decisions in our businesses and in our lives? A few years ago, a key executive at Colgate-Palmolive, a toothpaste company, had a scientific challenge. His team had developed a new best-in-class fluoride that they were meshing in their toothpaste. But there was a mechanical flow problem. The fluoride was getting stuck in the equipment. It wasn't meshing well. All the best chemists internally were trying to figure out why. Nobody could. It was costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars. So at that point, the executive said, after asking all the best chemists internally, why don't we ask a different network? And they ended up posting this fluoride challenge on a website called Innocentive, which is a crowdsourcing community for scientists. Within just a few days, after they labeled the problem as a chemistry problem and targeted the chemists online, a physicist looked at the problem online, a physicist named Emergn, and he said to himself, this wasn't a chemistry problem, this was a physics problem. It was about charged particles. You charge the fluoride one way, the toothpaste the other, instantly the problem was solved. Colgate learned a few things from this experience. The first thing they learned is that they didn't even dare to ask the physicists at their own company because they had labeled it as a chemistry problem. They also realized that the physicist that solved the problem would have never been hired by Colgate because he didn't have the traditional resume. And in today's world, what the company realized is not only would this problem not be easily solved just by a simple algorithm, but they needed the human context of that physicist to design the question differently in order to get to the right answer. I wanted to start off with these two stories to have us think about where are we today in our truly connected world in the age of machines, robotics, AI, nanotechnology. It is not just about the individual, and it's not just about the institution, it is about the collective. But it's about driving empowerment and accountability beyond just algorithms and data. It's ensuring that we know when to use human insights and when we don't have to, and we can leverage the technology that's available to us. What we're also facing in the world today that some of the speakers have already discussed is a crisis in connectivity. The average manager spends 16 hours a week on their email inbox. Worse, only 27% of that email is relevant to day-to-day work. $30 billion in salary cost is wasted every year in unproductive meetings, and employees are overwhelmed, inefficient, and unable to operate at high levels. But at the same time that we're seeing this over-connectivity, we're also seeing that the marginal value of insights generated versus the data acquired to achieve those insights is significantly decreasing. Our rise in access to data and tools is actually reducing often our ability to leverage the human insights we need most. 10 years ago, I was working on Wall Street at Lehman Brothers, exactly 10 years ago, and I worked through the Lehman bankruptcy. I saw very clearly that it was not a crisis of access to data, algorithms, new technologies. It was a crisis in being able to identify and leverage human insights that led to the world's largest financial crisis. And in today's world, what I see, I've spent the last decade looking at one key question. As CEOs try to lead and drive growth, how do they manage complexity? How do they work within this world of over-connectivity with the rise of new tools that we all have access to? And what I found on one end, it truly is not about managing control, it is about relinquishing control, around driving an empowerment and allowing voices to be heard at all levels like we heard this morning. But it's also about reducing complexity by empowering a new breed of a networked leader. A networked leader that is able to understand when human insight matters more than technology, when you need to stop the algorithm and you need a different perspective from human experience, and a leader that understands when you don't have to. And I believe that there's a key skill that we need to build among workforces today in order to elevate this new breed of networked leaders, and that skill is called connectional intelligence. Connectional intelligence is the capability to consistently drive breakthrough insights and value by fully harnessing the power of our networks, data, but also human insights. We've all heard of IQ as basic knowledge. 15 years ago, emotional intelligence came to stage. But in today's world, we can't just rely on IQ and EQ. With the rise of tools and technologies, we need to understand and build the human skill of what to use and when not to use the tools we have access to, and when human experience matters more. As we embark on this conversation about the post-job society, despite the massive risks and the opportunities that we'll be discussing on the panel, I truly believe that it is this networked leader with connectional intelligence that will be one of the most critical aspects of driving growth and prosperity, and one of the last categories to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica.
Okay.
Julia, will you
All
share
right,
with us,
I'm up.
please?
I'm just going to sit in my chair so I can keep an eye on my timekeeping. Listen, this question that we're addressing in this panel overall of, is what are the overall effects of these transformational technologies going to be for human prosperity? Well, I have the great fortune of that this question was recently answered by someone much smarter than me. The very same question was posed. Would super intelligent computers be a threat or a boon to humanity? So this was one of the great thinkers in the field of artificial intelligence, Stuart Russell at University of California at Berkeley. And his answer was, this is not like the weather. We get to choose what it's going to be. We don't simply have to endure what unfolds. And so whether or not AI is a threat to the human race or not depends on whether or not we make it a threat to the human race. And when he says we, I I think in that moment he was talking about the technology community, the creators of these tools, but I also think he was talking about we in the larger sense of all of us who were involved in the discourse around this. You know, because scientific and technological breakthroughs tend to get, they tend to get all the credit for changing the world. And it can be easy to overlook the super high importance of social policy making in ensuring that things turn out in these periods of technological transformation for the net good. If you think of the Industrial Revolution, the reason that it proved in the end to be so beneficial to human prosperity was because it created the middle class. But that didn't happen simply because of steam power and machinery. We also needed the social and the legal innovations that were created as part of that same revolution. So we needed those minimum wage laws, we needed those child labor laws, laws protecting unions, regulations governing workplace safety, environmental protections. All of that social policy making had to go along with that technological transformation. And without innovations like those, average folks don't benefit, or perhaps don't benefit much at all from technological breakthroughs. Luddites get a terrible rap. I mean, we all make fun of the Luddites these days. Well, recently I was looking a little into, I actually bought a book, Writings of the Luddites, the collected writings of the Luddites. It's a fascinating book, and I bet it surprises you to hear that the Luddites did much writing. We think of the Luddites as the machine smashers. We think of them as vandals who had no vision, who had a knee-jerk reaction to what would happen to them in a time of technological change. Well, in fact, and probably like I used to, a lot of people in this room think of that as sort of the small band of vandals. The interesting thing about the Luddites is that it was a very broad-based social movement, and it was cropping up sort of in a sort of, you might say, Occupy Wall Street type of way, or in the way of modern social movements. It was cropping up in lots of places simultaneously. And one thing that's really interesting about it is that it was maybe one of the first branded social movements. You know, now they all have a brand like Black Lives Matters or Occupy Wall Street. Luddite was a brand. It was something they all chose to sign their letters to the editor or their placards with because they couldn't put their own names in print. This was a highly illegal activity that they were involved in, so they signed all these things, General Ludd, Ned Ludd. My point, though, about them is that they were very, very interested in these social changes that needed to take place. That's what they were doing all this writing about, posting things to newspapers and signing them from General Ludd. So we can't simply be saying that everything will work out in the end, which is what those of us who make fun of the Luddites say. Well, look, it all worked out in the end, and that's the way of all technology transformations. This one will too. We really cannot just leave it to that. Smart machines will certainly be a boon to human prosperity overall, on the average, but the gains, the fear is, and it's a justified fear, that the gains will tend toward concentration in the hands of the few, and that the bulk of people will be left behind. So the same basic levers are available to us now that were available in the Industrial Revolution. We need to pull all those levers. I guess I would particularly say that education reform has to be a huge priority. And on two lines here. I think number one is how can the availability of these technologies, which allow for highly personalized education according to a given student's level of understanding of a topic. I think AI can be a terrific tool in the hands of an empathic educator, and we should be using it much more. But then there's also the fact of what is the educational system that will produce the new workforce for the new age in the way that the public education system that was created in service of the Industrial Revolution suited the workforce needs of that age. So all of these levers could collectively achieve a great deal, but the key is that they're all pulling together in the same direction. And for that to happen, it seems like there needs to be some kind of a shared philosophy or some guiding principle by which we're making decisions on many fronts about the social change that will go with the rise of smart machines. And so I have my advocated guiding principle, and it goes like this. We need workplaces that combine sophisticated machines and humans in partnerships of mutual augmentation. And we could parse that sentence, but that's my philosophy. Workplaces that aim for augmentation, and that is a mutual leveraging of the different strengths of humans and machines. That's something that knowledge workers should embrace personally, that employers, managers should be pursuing for competitive reasons, not as an act of altruism. And it's also something that societies should encourage in ways both big and small. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you very much. Rahaf, can I ask you to share your view then?
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon. I'm so delighted to be here. I was very intrigued and actually delighted with the subject matter of this panel, because oftentimes when we speak about the future of work, we tend to focus so much, as Julia said, on the technology itself, on AI, on algorithms, on robotics, on predictive data. And I think what I loved about this term, which, Richard, I'm going to start using all the time now, is I love this idea of inclusive prosperity. Because to me, that's at the heart of what we are all trying to achieve here. I think people would be less concerned about the threat of automation and the threat of AI if they were guaranteed a prosperous, healthy, safe life. And so my work as a digital anthropologist has been to look at the intersection of technology and culture and how it's impacting our beliefs and some of the cultural values that we have, specifically in relation to work. So work, as we all know, has been a central, important theme in all of our lives. Industriousness and productivity have become almost like religions, where every day there are an endless amount of apps and books and frameworks that are pushing all of us to do more, work harder. And as Erica mentioned, all of the people who are using technology has now given us the ability to always be working, to always be connected. The interesting thing is that as we move towards this era where we can work longer and longer and more than ever, there are economic conditions and systemic conditions that are making the availability of work much less available to people. It's getting harder and harder to find meaningful, long-term work. And the things that we've considered, the notion of a career, the notion of a job, is very different than what it used to be even 10 years ago. So now we're finding that a lot of the challenges and a lot of the ideas that we had around our identity, around our morality, around who we are, our social status that have been so linked to our work is changing. And that is creating a lot of psychological distress. So what I'd like to do is really talk about two aspects of how I believe our belief systems are impacting the way that we work. So the first is to talk very quickly about the American dream. And the American dream as an ideology is probably the most famous ideology that has been exported. Now, we all know this. It says that if you work hard enough, you will achieve anything that you set your mind to, that you will be successful if you put in the effort. Now, the flip side of the American dream, what we don't often say, what is unspoken, is the idea that if for whatever reason you are not successful, then it must mean that you're not working hard enough. And this is very dangerous because as we see with technology coming in, there are entire industries of people that are being replaced not because they don't work hard enough, not because they're not smart enough, but because there are technological innovations that are making their jobs redundant. However, psychologically speaking, we as a society are still linked to this idea that it's our personal effort. So there is a lot of shame, there is a lot of anger, there is a lot of fear, and we need to start talking about this as well, because no amount of technological innovation is actually going to stop people from feeling and reacting in a fear-based way, in an anger-based way, if we don't tackle this core belief and if we don't start talking about it. The second element that I want to talk about in terms of belief systems is that the technology that we use today has its own belief systems embedded in it as well. Most organizations use technology to measure their performance, to measure their talent, and many of these technological tools are embedded with the philosophies and best practices of an idea of success that was left over from the Industrial Revolution. That performance is linked to productivity, is linked to continuous output, and we have just digitized this approach using different tools, and we are now using it for knowledge workers. What we know now about brain science is that knowledge workers and creativity cannot be managed in the same way that we manage an assembly line. To look at it even further, the belief systems that we use in the belief systems and the technology that we use on a day-to-day basis is all around us. Twitter has a worldview that ideas should be shared in a brief way, that the way that we communicate should be summed up and reduced to a couple of sentences. That is their worldview, that is their belief, and we are seeing the implications of that in the political sphere when you have politicians that are tweeting very complicated policies, very nuanced ideas that are now reduced to a couple of sentences. Facebook and Google and a lot of these algorithmically driven companies are all based on this idea that you as the consumer should get what you want. The news that you want, the products that you want, the worldview that you want. This is a specific philosophy. But culturally, take a step back and consider the differences between what you need and what you actually want. Yes, I would love to get everything that I want all the time, but the things that I need and the things that I want might be different. But we are creating a digital infrastructure where we are making objectivity and neutral discourse not relevant because we are too busy giving people this only what they want and reflecting their own worldviews back to them. So for me, when I look at inclusive prosperity and the future of work, I think before we focus on the technology, we need to start having very real conversations around what is our world going to look like when the thing that we identify with the most, our work, our jobs, is so linked to what we do, is so linked to who we are. And if we are going to start to have these conversations, they need to happen on a legislative level, but they also need to happen on an individual level between colleagues, as a leadership issue. So I really believe that we need to decouple our identity from what we do, because otherwise all the technology in the world is not going to shield us from the psychological impacts of these big shifts. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahaf. Thank you. Thank you, Don.
This is a great conversation, and power corrupts. PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But listening to the conversation this morning, I thought a few slides might actually be helpful. I'm going to begin with a self-criticism. I have changed my mind about something very fundamental. 5 years ago, I was asked to write the anniversary edition, the 20th anniversary edition of the digital economy. And I had to reflect on what had actually occurred in the last 20 years. The book held up well, and I was very heady about technology. The old media was centralized. It was one way. Everyone is a passive recipient. It was controlled by powerful forces. The new media is distributed. It's one-to-one. It's many-to-many. It has this awesome neutrality. People are active. It will be what we want it to be, and surely it will bring about a more prosperous world. However, I did say some things could go wrong. And there was a list, actually, of 7 of them. I said, it's possible we could lose our privacy in an irrevocable way. I said, it's possible the benefits of the digital age could be captured asymmetrically and we could have growing social inequality. I said, I think the internet will bring us together, but we could have a fragmentation of public discourse. I won't go through them all, but it was check, 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 all 7 of them have occurred. So this is a kind of a humbling thing. Why is this happening? And we're focusing on prosperity, but the panel will get into some broader issues. Well, the new asset class of the digital age is data, the new oil, and all of you create it. But what has happened is that this data has been captured asymmetrically by some large companies and institutions. And these are basically a new species of business called a digital conglomerate. We've never seen anything like this before. The 5 most valuable companies in America today are, in order, Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook. And those, along with big financial institutions, are getting most of the value. And we see all this data today about growing inequality. The 51st percentile is declining for the first time in decades. 51st percentile family or individual. So, do you remember before capitalism, there was feudalism? You worked the land, and everything you created got given away to the feudal lords, but you got to keep a bit. Does that remind you of anything today? The virtual you, your identity that's full of all of this data, this exhaust that you leave along a trail of digital crumbs, has been captured. And it's very valuable. Now, because we're in Vienna, I wanted to just pull up this slide, because this is 9 years ago, and it struck me as pertinent. I gave the closing talk to Sybos in Vienna 9 years ago, and there were 10,000 bankers in the room, and it was in September, 2 days after Lehman Brothers fell. And I looked out at this sea of deer in the headlights, and I did throw away my PowerPoint that day, and I gave a critique of the financial industry. Houston, we have a big problem here. This institution almost brought down the global capitalist system. So that was the first era of the information age. Where are we going now? Well, it's a helpful device to think of the 4th industrial age. The first was steam. We mechanized shovels and hoes. The second was electricity, created the industrial production line. The third was the computer, mainframes, minis, PCs, the internet, the web, social media, the mobile web, big data, the cloud. And now technology is infusing itself into everything, into the physical world. We're animating billions and trillions of inert objects. We now have systems, machine learning, artificial intelligence, that do things that they weren't programmed to do. Technology is coming into our bodies. And at the heart of all of these is the underlying technology of cryptocurrencies called blockchain. Blockchain. Not the most sonorous word in the world, but this is nothing less than the second era of the internet. For decades, we've had the internet of information. Now we're getting an internet of value, where anything of value, from money to stocks to bonds to intellectual property, carbon credits, loyalty points, cultural things like art and music, even votes, any asset that has value can be managed, transacted in a secure and private way. And this, to me, comes about because of the biggest innovation in computer science in a generation. We can now trust each other without an intermediary, and trust is not achieved by an institution, it's achieved by cryptography, collaboration, and some clever code. So let me end with two thoughts. There's the good news and the bad news. The good news is, once again, this is 1994, once again the technology genie has escaped from the bottle. And it was summoned by an anonymous person at this uncertain time in human history, and it's not going to solve any problems, but it does give us another kick at the can to attack this prosperity issue. This is an extraordinary technology. We can bring 2 billion people into the global economy overnight. These are people who don't have enough money for a bank account, they don't have an identity, but many of them have a supercomputer in their pocket. And they don't need a traditional identity to be banked, given blockchain technology. We can all now soon have our own identity that's in a black box that sweeps up all this data for us. And we can use this data to plan our lives, and we can even monetize it if we want. We can protect our rights through immutable records. 70% of the land titles in the developing world are not enforceable. You're in India, you got a little farm, you go to the land title office to get it transferred, and someone says you don't own it because someone's bribed a local clerk there. Well, you put land titles on a blockchain, and that's what's happening now, and nobody can mess with it because it's not changeable. And it's infinitely more secure than the kind of computer systems we have today. We could create a real sharing economy, not Uber and Airbnb. You know, they're great companies, but they have little to do with sharing. They're successful because they don't share. They aggregate services together and sell them. Well, imagine if they become an actual cooperative where those companies are replaced by a distributed application on a blockchain. There are projects underway to do that. Remittances is the biggest flow of money from the developed world to the developing world, almost $1 trillion. These people are getting charged 10 to 20%. You ever hear of a cross-border email charge? Well, now with blockchain platforms, they can do this not in 7 days, but in seconds, and they get charged 1.5%. We can ensure that the creators of value are compensated for that value. All these people get ripped off. Musicians that create content, but the Internet of Information broke our intellectual property regime. And we published value, which was because we didn't have a native digital medium for value. Now we do. And when Imogen posts a song on a blockchain music system, the song is inside a smart contract. The song acts as a business, protecting her intellectual property rights. Halcyon days of entrepreneurship. With blockchain, little companies can have all the capability of big companies without the main liabilities. And finally, we can make some progress in reinventing democracy. So that's the good news. The bad news is this technology is really powerful. What's it going to do, say, to jobs? In America, the #1 job type for men, 48 out of 50 states, is truck driver. I think most of those will be gone, not in 50 years, but in a decade to 15 years. #1 job type for women is cashiers. Schumpeter, creative destruction. Technology comes in and it blows things up, but it always replaces, right? With new wealth and new jobs and new prosperity. I don't see a way that that's going to happen given our existing social contract. So, and that's just the beginning. Technology can diagnose people better than doctors, and it can dispense medicine better than pharmacists, and it can analyze x-rays better than radiologists. We're not talking about blue-collar work here. We're talking about a broad swath of knowledge work and white-collar work. So when we moved from the industrial age, from the agrarian age to to the industrial age, we developed a social contract. We said, people are going to need to be literate. We'll create public education. You got to go to school. It's a law. We said people are going to live in the city. They're going to need a social safety net. We figured out that you can't have one oil company owning all the oil. So we created anti-monopoly legislation. We figured out if you're going to be a publicly traded company, you ought to tell your shareholders something once a year. The SEC Act of 1934. We've done none of that today. So I'm going to end now, but I've been working on this idea of a new social contract, and so on. I've got 9 dimensions whereby the old industrial contract is breaking down because of the impact of this technology. And I think that we're going to need a new contract across a whole series of levels. I'm not sure that a job and making an income will be tied together, for example. How do we inform ourselves in a world where the old ways of doing that are breaking down? So this is on Tapscott.com. I've got a document. It's almost a book-sized document, but I'm just opening it up, and I want everyone to come and comment on it if you would like. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dhawan. Thank you very much. Thank you for your contribution. So I'm just thinking about some of the ways we can make these topics more practical and useful for the audience, and I've been taking some notes. And if we try to boil down some of this conversation, I mean, at the most basic level, what I'm thinking about over here is if you look at any of these new technologies and how they're affecting our ability to not only communicate, but even undermine our public discourse, how might we respond to that? Erica, can I start with you on that?
Well, I think there's a couple of key things. First, technology has been an amplifier in very positive ways, but what it's also causing, as Rahaf mentioned, is this siloed nature of what information we're receiving. And from that, if you look at Facebook or Google, the ability for 5 big companies based in Silicon Valley to manipulate the information and how we communicate. And so I think that both the danger and the response is to design better ways to ensure that we're having true productive discourse and not being manipulated by large companies.
Right. And Rahaf, you mentioned something really interesting about belief systems. And before we came up, we were having a sideline chat on dignity and what this all means to people in terms of how it develops. How would you add to that question in terms of what it means for our human conversation, our public discourse?
I mean, I think what's really funny is that the technology is new, so everyone's talking about the technology, but there is this hidden force that we are all influenced by, which is our belief system. And oftentimes we tend to discount that because people think they can compensate for it using policy or organizational culture. I'll give you a very quick example, which is Netflix had put a policy in place 2 years ago that people could take as much paid time off as they wanted. No questions asked, as long as they were getting their work done. And then they were surprised when not many people ended up taking advantage of this policy. And when they asked them why, they said they weren't worried about what their manager would think. They were actually afraid about what their colleagues would think and about how their colleagues would translate or would interpret their going on vacation as them not being deserving of that next promotion or that next raise. And you said to me, that we were talking very briefly about universal basic income, and you said, well, that removes some of the doesn't that remove some of the dignity of work? And to add to what you said, we chose as a society to put together dignity and to put together work and to associate our identities of what we do so strongly with who we are. But that is something that we chose. And if we were to reframe that, I think having an economic system where people were guaranteed a certain level of prosperity, I actually think personally that is far more enabling people to have dignity than to reduce their contribution to society to a form of economic output. So I think, and we can deep dive into that later, but I think the idea is we really need to come back to the human element, because our cultural assumptions around work will trump technology, and it will trump leadership decisions, and it will trump policy every single time. So you can't unravel any of that without dealing with the core.
That's great, thank you. Julia, you sparked an interest when you used the word augmentation. So I guess one of the things that immediately I thought about was, if there is a perceived threat with new technologies coming on board that could change the way we work or even how we work in this regard, can you explain a little more how that augmentation piece would work? Can you clarify that more?
Yeah, although, can I just say one thing about the internet and how it has affected the discourse, and then if we want to get into that. But one thing I think is really interesting about social media, I mean, we all love to dwell on its being an echo chamber, which it is, and people find affirmation for the pre-existing biases there. But there is something that's really, salutary about that set of mechanisms, and that is that now there's a sort of expectation that as an individual who would in the past have just been a consumer of ideas, that now there's an expectation that you'll have a take on what somebody else is saying or what has happened in the news. And so, of course, we turn into idea producers. But there's just a much stronger expectation in public discourse that people will, vote in this way in terms of just putting out their view. And so I think it's not surprising that the very first, wave of that would not be maybe the most mature, sophisticated form of that, and that there is a lot of just retweeting and liking and lack of originality. But I think what we're seeing over time is people developing the capacity to actually think for themselves and actually put a point of view out there. And I think it's actually a very good thing for the broader public discourse. Just on augmentation, the idea there is just fundamentally that there's been a mindset of automation with technologies, that the reason you bring them in is because they're labor saving. And labor saving, of course, means that you need less labor. You can get rid of some of this very problematic wetware in the organization, because after all, people are really problematic to have around. They're needy. They need, for instance, plumbing, and lots of other things. They need perks. They're not completely trustworthy. You need to put lots of systems in place. They get tired. So it's, there are a lot of reasons that you might want to just simply bring in a machine to do the work that they were doing. But when we're talking about cognitive technologies, if that means that now you're no longer employing people to move to the next level of work, but you're somehow thinking that the decision making that your organization needs to do is simply going to be done by machines, then you have set yourself up to remove any chance of competitive advantage that you might have, because there's nothing more replicable for your competitors than your investment in technology. Technology travels extremely easily. So what you have to do more than ever is figure out how to get the competitive advantage out of the part of your business that is so hard to replicate and so hard to scale, and that's the human strengths that you continue to rely on. So you have got to use the technology to leverage human strengths, not because that's just good for humans and we're all human and this is, again, some act of altruism, but because that's the only chance you have of winning in competitive markets.
Can I say one more thing
Sure.
about augmentation? So when I think about augmentation, I go to the nanotechnology and bioengineering format. So if you think about the industrial age, humans produced fuel, food, and weapons. In today's age, humans can produce bodies, brains, and minds. And one of the greatest fears I have is we'll see this enhanced class of superhumans that are able to use these new breakthrough technologies, and it could really lead to an elite class. And, you know, I think of movies like Iron Man, but what that could really do to society and how it could radically shift and cause those that are poor not only to become further behind, but at a deeper level beyond natural evolution.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think it's a good segue, because Dawn, I wanted to ask you, so if you look at this whole social contract piece that you were describing, you mentioned, for example, in the US, certain jobs that men have or women have. What is the broader social impact that you really kind of take away from that?
Well, let me give you an example. And this is not in the future, this is today. So when Alex and I were writing the book, we wondered, how far could this go? Could you have a company that was software, where you had no CEO, no management, no people? It'd be a bunch of smart contracts and autonomous agents on a blockchain. It could raise money in a crowdfunding campaign, which, by the way, have raised more money this year than all venture capital, $3 billion. It could be programmed to do its work. That'd be kind of cool, because you could program out things like moral hazard, you know, where managers do things that are not in the interests of their stakeholders. They give themselves big bonuses and so on. And we called it the Distributed Autonomous Organization. We almost didn't publish it because we thought, you know, fine line between vision and hallucination. And it sounds a little futuristic, but we did. A week after the book came out, an organization was launched called the Distributed Autonomous Organization. It had no CEO, no management, no people. It was a bunch of smart contracts and autonomous agents on the Ethereum blockchain. It was a venture capital company, and its goal, first step, was to raise money. In 3 weeks, this entity made of software raised 143 million US dollars. 143. An order of magnitude bigger than any other crowdfunding campaign that set about to do its work. Now, it's not a totally happy ending, because there was a programming error in one of the smart contracts. And in the end, the creators gave the money back to the funders. But, you know, Bob Dylan, there's something going on here and you don't know what it is. We're talking about the deep structure and architecture of the firm. And I think if Peter Drucker were to be here, and this is always a dangerous thing to do, but he would not say this is necessarily a terrible thing, because Drucker, among other things, was a pragmatist, but he was also very aware of the big contextual changes. A lot of his later writings were about the information age. And he referred to middle managers, for example, as the boosters of the faint signals that pass for communication in the pre-information organization. So there aren't going to be a bunch of these organizations wiping out all knowledge work in the next decade or so. But this is a little taste of where we're going. And the old social contract that we have, I don't think is going to work. We're going to have to find a way to build a new one. I have no idea how we get from here to there, but I think the contours of what is needed are now starting to shape up.
Okay, and so that leads me to something else, because in our closing minutes, I want to get your perspectives on two distinct topics. So one is education, right? So some of you mentioned education. What type of education and what does it look like do you think is required to help people understand what's coming or how to respond to it? Especially if we're talking about it in the context of a social contract, or we're talking about it as a belief system, or we're talking about it as shared philosophies or augmentation. I mean, what do we need to tell people now that's more practical in your minds? If you were sitting in a boardroom with a bunch of leaders of a company, what would you say? Rahaf, can we start with you on that?
Sure. I mean, I think the good news here is that when you look at information consumption, what we really see is a set of skills that can be learned and can be developed. We have been taught over the course of, when you look at how people have been taught at schools and at universities, we were taught to consume information in a linear way. We were taught to consume information in a limited ecosystems. We were taught with textbooks. And now that we are entering this age where there is unlimited information, where the ecosystem is just almost infinite, I just think the first step is to prepare students to actually consume information in that space. And I teach MBA students in Paris, and one of the things that we've had to develop in the course curriculum is an information diet. Because if you look at the way that you're consuming information, so many of us are skimming. It's almost like junk food. You're reading, tweets, you're reading 800-word blog posts, you're reading this stuff that's coming up on your feed. And I asked them, because they have to do a research project, I asked them, how many of you are going to read, we're planning to read a book on this topic, we're planning on reading long form, we're planning on doing a detailed analysis of the different perspectives and understanding, where people's intentions were and what they were publishing. And the fact that very few of them raised their hand, I ended up having to create a grid for them, a checklist to teach them when you are consuming information that you need to be able to kind of tick these boxes and make sure you're consuming a healthy and varied amount of content that has actually been created. And the second thing I'll say from a philosophical perspective, and I think it was the CEO of Microsoft who said this, who said we're moving away from a know-it-all age to a learn-it-all age. And I think we need to become comfortable with the idea that we're never going to know everything, we're never going to be able to consume everything. So we need to start developing these abilities that enable us to continuously ask questions, be uncomfortable with uncertainty, and within an organization where we have job descriptions and boxes that we want to put people in and 3-year strategic plans, that we need to start planning on a strategic level for that ambiguity. So how can you plan for ambiguity in your job descriptions, in your service offerings, in the way your employees are spending their time? These are the types of changes that need to happen. It's the only way that we can really plan for what cannot be, plan for the unplanned. But the good news, again, is these are things that can be implemented and things that can be learned. We just have to make them a priority.
Don, could I ask you for your view on the education question?
On education?
Yeah, what do you think we need to be educating people in terms of how do they respond to these coming topics and real issues?
Okay, well, this is a big topic, and we're almost out of time, so I'll say something very simple. The industrial age social contract is you ought to go to school through high school, and that's until you're 16 years old. We have the wealth in societies to enable post-secondary education. And we also have the wealth to enable some new mechanisms for lifelong learning, because let's face it, when you used to graduate, you kept up in your chosen field. You were set for life. Today you're set for, 15 minutes. And if you took a technical course, half of what you learned in the first year is obviously by the time you get to the 4th year. So it's not really what you know that's important, I don't think, when you graduate. It's your capability to think critically, to solve problems, to collaborate, to research, to put things in context, your passion for learning, which, as an aside, is a case for an undergraduate liberal arts education. I think the only people the only 20-year-olds who should be studying accounting are people who always dreamed of being an accountant, because you should study something that you have a passion for. But anyway, I digress. So what does that mean from a point of view of a social contract? We have resources now to do some pretty interesting things to equip us more for lifelong learning in a whole new kind of world where our jobs actually may be separate from the way that we make an income. I mean, let's face it, there's lots to do in society. This leisure society thing was always a pipe dream. And as Rahaf and others have made the point, people get satisfaction out of their jobs. But the idea that I go to a job to make money, I think that may change.
Okay.
And sure, it probably means a universal basic income, but I don't think that's the main sort of contractual thing in the New Deal. The main thing is that if you want to work, you should be able to have a job. Now, it may not be funded by traditional ways and market forces. Maybe there's a lot of this will be in a commons, there'll be not-for-profits. We do some things that enable a whole new generation of entrepreneurship and so on. But that everybody should be able to work and increasingly to do something that gives them a sense of satisfaction. This is possible. We just need to come up with a new deal to do it.
Right. Thank you. Erica and Julia, could I ask you both to spend our last couple minutes responding to that?
Yeah, I'll just make one comment. I believe that the educational system needs to focus less on just helping students consume information, but actually become sense makers of the information. We have so much information now that we're inundated with acquiring knowledge instead of truly sense making what data is useful, what insights are not useful.
Very good. Julia?
You know, so much about our education is about creating in students the capabilities that we are now busy creating in machines. And we have, and we still are kind of stuck with this mindset that in order to be gainfully employed in the era of machine intelligence, that you have to somehow be able to outthink the machines. And that's sort of setting yourself up to compete in a game you cannot win. You know, the education system, I think, should be putting a lot more focus on some of the things that Don was talking about, maybe the learning how to learn skills, learning what your passion is, but also learning a lot of the soft skills about how to work effectively in a team. And I think that, in fact, we see a lot of that evolution going on in schools today. I know group projects are a much bigger part of high school education, elementary school education, than they were when I was young. So I think this is a dawning realization that we need soft skills training at school.
I want to thank you all. This is a fascinating topic, and I appreciate all the feedback. Thank you.